Alright, we got another good video here. Haven't watched this guy in a while. His name is That Chapter. Super famous guy. I'm sure you guys probably already know him. Um, so yeah, this one is hikers discover horrifying secret in national park. So let's get into it.
My name is Mike, and in this little video, we are going to look at some baffling mysteries and horrors, all of them occurring in national parks. Every year, in not only American national parks, but ones across the world, unexplainable and disturbing events occur. But today, as always, we are going to look at 3 of them. But before we begin, please subscribe to see new stories for the dark every single week. Now, let's give it a go. Our first story today not only involves one mysterious disappearance in the woods, it actually involves 2. The second, though, would not have happened, without the first one happening. See, in 1988, a 50-year-old sports journalist was kind of just sick of it all. He's a bit fed up. He was a veteran journalist in the Chicago area, and you know what? There's only so many times you can write about dab airs before slamming your head against the wall looks like a much better prospect. He needed to get away from it all. He'd been a journalist for 22 years, and he was approaching his late 40s, he was approaching 50, he was 50, he was really thinking to himself, it's now or never. It was kind of a midlife crisis point for Keith Reinhardt. And so that year of 1988, he decided to leave behind his 3 children, his wife, and take a sabbatical from the Daily Herald. He would be gone for 90 days, and he went all the way to the town of Silver Plume, Colorado, a 15-hour car drive away from his home in the Chicago suburb of Algonquin. So why did Keith Reinhardt, leave behind his sports journalism career in Chicago, move all the way across? It's a fair distance away. And I mean, his life, in Chicago was quite good. Happily married, 3 kids, sports journalist like so many people would kill to write about sports all day. Well, as I said, he just needed to get away. Why he chose this place in particular? He had an old friend named Ted who lived here, and he would always write and call Keith just saying basically how beautiful this place, Silver Plume, this small town, was in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. Keith had even written about Ted, his friend since he was 5 years old, and about Ted's life in Silver Plume in an article in a 1987 issue of the Daily Herald. So Keith, he had his 90 days off from work, and he wanted to do 3 things. 1 was get fit. 2 was he wanted to get over his horrifying fear of heights. And 3 was to finally sit down and write. He wanted to write fiction, though. He was sick of journalists reporting on current events. He wanted to write, in his own mind, he wanted to write the great American novel. And so he thought to himself there was no better place to do it. He was going to go there for a while. His wife, Caroline, was eventually supposed to follow him over, but he was going to be secluded for a time. Upon arriving there, Keith actually caught a lucky break, if you can believe that. There was an empty antiques store, and it was right across the road from the diner that his buddy Ted ran. This was a perfectly empty place. The owner was happy to rent it out to Keith, and so the plan was he would move into this store, he would sell antiques, he would sell trinkets, and in the meantime just go hiking then and start scribbling away. Shinny, it does not get any better than that. Now this town, Silver Plume, it's absolutely tiny. About 100 years before this story takes place, in the late 1800s, there had been a silver rush, so there had been a boom. But now, in our more modern times, like 1988, there was less than 130 people lived there. This tiny town situated between these 2 huge mountains, deep in the Rocky Mountains. And the town itself did have a bit of a dark history. About 100 years before, there had been a mysterious murder in the town. But that wasn't the only mystery that Silver Plume would have. Tom soon learned why this antique store was empty, and that in itself was a mystery. It had previously been rented by a man named Tom Young, a former Army Special Forces veteran. Then he became an art teacher, sort of a Bob Ross type character, and more recently he had been renting that store and selling books. That was, however, until September of 1987, when both Tom Young and his dog, Gus, mysteriously vanished. This would have been just a couple of months before Keith himself moved into town. Now, Tom had always been, considered a bit eccentric, a bit odd. He just lived by himself. He would play catch with his dog Gus using a doll's head as a ball, which is kind of creepy. But, other than that, he kind of just kept to himself and, he wasn't like disliked or anything like that. Just like one of the many quirky characters who inhabit this town of Silver Plume. You kind of have to be a quirky character to live in a place like this. On September 7th of 1987, both Tom and Gus were headed off for a walk into the mountains, and that's when they were last seen. Now, shortly before this, Tom had begun telling people he was planning on going to Europe for a vacation. So when people saw neither Tom nor Gus, they figured, well, that's where he went. But, when word began with no sight or sound from them and the police began to look into what happened to Tom, they found no evidence he had ever booked anything. No plane tickets, no nothing that he was planning on going to Europe. And they couldn't find Gus the dog in any of the nearby kennels where, Tom would have kept him if he was going abroad. So what happened after Tom and Gus walked into those mountains? It began to consume Keith, as he was renting the store Tom used to own just a couple months previous. Keith was now sitting in Tom's very chair, writing his own novel. And as a writer, it was like the ultimate inspiration for Keith. I mean, he would walk around this antique store, he could still feel Tom's presence right there. He began to question the locals, like constantly, what do you think happened to Tom? Tell me about Tom. Tell me good stories about Tom. His own plan, had been to write the great American novel, like a fictional novel, but then he threw out that plan. He kicked it out the door and he began changing what his story was going to be about, and Tom was his key inspiration. Now the character in his book was going to be named Guy Gypsum, and it was basically like half Tom Young, half himself, Keith. He was like mixing both of their lives together. Guy Gypsum was from a town called White Bloom, and he was writing this in Silver Plume. And so Keith, sort of writing about what happened to Tom, sort of about writing about what happened to himself, he realized there's so many similarities between himself and Tom. Both had served in the US military, both had been stationed in West Berlin, both had moved to Silver Plume. Even their birthdays were like around the same time of the year. However, things would come crashing down for Keith when, in the middle of writing this book over the summer of 1988, Tom Young was found. Tom Young's body would be found. On July 31st, 1988, two hunters came across Tom and Gus's remains in the mountains. Each had a bullet wound to the head. It was later learned that Tom had purchased the gun 4 days before he disappeared. It was soon ruled to be self-inflicted. Though, upon the discovery, some questions about what really happened to Tom Young in those woods and in those mountains remained. Namely, well, there was a couple of things, honestly, folks. One was that Tom's gun, if it was self-inflicted, you'd think his gun would be found in his hand or right beside him. It wasn't. It was kind of found like a distance away. So, but it was a couple of months in between, wind, whatever, could have moved the gun. But that wouldn't explain why a shredded tarp was found covering Tom and Gus's bodies. Locals began to think that somebody else had been there and had killed them. Even though the authorities ruled it as Tom killed Gus, then it was, then he had ended his own life. People remained unconvinced, especially because Tom loved Gus. Even if he wanted to do something to himself, he wouldn't have done that to Gus. He would have given Gus away or something. He never would have hurt him. So this then threw a spanner into Keith's work as he was in the middle of writing this book. It kind of just went out the window. Sometimes, you just don't want an answer. And then on August 4th, Keith called up his editor back at the Daily Herald in Chicago, asking if he could change his beat from, he was the football beat guy, and now he was asking if he could be the basketball beat guy, as the Bulls were coming up. It truly seemed like Keith was preparing to head back to Chicago as his sabbatical was coming to an end, and he was ready to get back to work. His inspiration was Tom Young, but now that his story had been answered, officially at least, Keith, he must have felt like his dream had come to an end. He had been consumed by the mystery of Tom Young, put his dreams and fantasies into his story, but reality had come crashing back. If the authorities' story is true, then Tom was simply a lonely, depressed man who decided to end it where he thought no one would ever find him. And Keith was now disillusioned by the mystery of the mountains. And it was time to go home to his wife and his kids. But he couldn't go back to the same old, same old. He needed something to change at least, even if it was as minor as the teams he covered. A few days then after that, on August 7th, Keith closed up his store for the final time. He told everybody he was going for a walk on Pendleton Mountain, the same mountain where Tom's body had been found just about a week before all of this. It was not a short hike. Reportedly, it would take many, many hours, and Keith was not dressed for it. But he was going up and he was telling everybody, I'm going to Pendleton Mountain. If I'm not back, call the rescuers, but I'm just going up to have a look. But then Keith vanished, never to be seen again. It was Keith's friend Ted who reported him missing, knowing that, he had left quite late and he hadn't come back. And in fact, the search began the following day. The search was massive for the first 4 days, and it led to a death, if you can believe that. A small search and rescue plane crashed, killing the pilot. But throughout all of this, no sign of Keith has ever been found. The last thing Keith wrote in his book, his novel, was this, quote, because it's eerie. Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now, and his motivations. Guy closed the door and then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above. Which seems exactly like what Keith did. There are some theories, of course. Some locals think that Keith left to go and start a new life somewhere else, or he had encountered, he'd gone towards a highway and encountered a serial killer on the highway. But the most popular theory about what really happened to Keith Reinhardt is that he was looking in a little bit too deeply into Tom Young's life and Tom Young's, more specifically, Tom Young's death. Maybe somebody thought he was digging too much, he was getting too close to whatever ended Tom's life, and decided to do the same to Keith. As I said, a lot of people don't think Tom Young died of, self causes, that somebody else had been out there in them, and maybe Keith was close to finding out who that was. Many searches have been done over the years, right up to his own son going up that mountain only recently.
Well, I think that there was foul play. I've always thought that.
His dad was a 50-year-old sports writer for a Chicago area newspaper who came to Colorado on a leave.
He came out here just to get see what he was all about himself. I think my dad stumbled across something, and he just knew too much.
His father had been writing a novel, believed based on Tom Young's disappearance. It was just 1 week after Young's body was found that Reinhardt went for a hike. It led to one of the biggest searches in Colorado history.
1,000,001 things could have happened to Keith Reinhardt. I mean, most likely he went up that mountain, he was in the dark, he wasn't dressed properly, and he just fell. Who knows what happened? As I said, 1,000,001 things could have happened in these two very strange disappearances. And some think maybe, possibly, kind of, sorta, could be two very strange murders. The case of Keith Reinhardt remains open. On May 19th, 1996, Laura Winans and her girlfriend Julie Williams, they set out to Shenandoah to do a section hike along the Appalachian Trail, which is, you just do a short bit of the trail. This was going to celebrate that Julie had just received a new job offer. Her dream job offer, she was due to start in 2 weeks and was beyond excited. Laura, or Lolly, as she was known by friends, and Julie were both experienced woods women. In fact, that's literally where they'd met almost 2 years earlier, at a group called Woods Women. Woods Women, though now defunct, it was a non-profit for women and for children, basically, teaching women and children how to survive out in the wilderness. It was the perfect place for, women, girls to meet and become friends. And Laura, Lolly, and Julie, they became much more than friends. They both gained confidence in their ability to be self-sufficient in the midst of nature, and they carried that confidence into their day-to-day lives, something that the girls wanted to share with others. Lolly Winans was from a seriously wealthy family, though you would not know that at all in the way that she presented herself. She often drove around in this rust bucket van, would often go to thrift stores, picking up secondhand clothing, all that sort of stuff. Vegetarian Lolly, she rejected the multiple luxuries being offered by being born into a wealthy family in the States. She was a real into the wild type person. When she was 5 years old, she asked her parents for a tent so she could camp out in their front garden. It started at an early age, but for not a good reason. It's believed that Lolly was being sexually abused by a trusted adult. This was something she never told her parents, and so her camping out in the wilderness and, beginning in the front garden, and then the wilderness was seen as a mental thing to separate herself from trauma. But that's how she found her love of discovery and everything wild, away from it all. Lolly grew up in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and after graduating high school, she moved across the country to attend Sterling College in Craftsbury Common, Vermont. Julie, on the other hand, grew up in St. Cloud, Minnesota. She was a serious athlete, winning the Minnesota State tennis doubles. Not only did she love languages, she was fluent in Spanish, but her first academic love was geology. Rocks, that's rocks, ladies and gentlemen. I'm talking, you got big rocks, you got small rocks, even got itty bitty rocks, but she was mad about all of them. Which rocks? Julie settled in Richmond, Vermont, a town big enough that she didn't feel she had to hide who she was, but without feeling swallowed up by the big city. And she kept up a busy but fulfilling work-life balance, splitting most of her days between hanging out with friends in the coffee shop beneath her apartment and working in a bookstore to support herself and her adventures. And it was then both of them going to attend Woodswomen that they met and they fell in love. So from arriving in the Shenandoah National Park on the 19th, Lolly, Julie, along with their golden retriever, Taj, they were making relatively good pace. They were doing about 5 miles a day, which actually sounds like quite good pace. They were really enjoying seeing each other, though they had been kind of in a long distance relationship for a time, as they both lived in the same state but a little bit apart. Lolly just a single semester away from graduation, and as I said, Julie, she was about to start her dream job in Vermont in 2 weeks' time. So they both had a lot to celebrate and look forward to. Sometime around May 24th, 1996, they were walking along the Appalachian Trail, and they found an old brindle trail that was set back around 250 yards from the main Appalachian Trail. They started walking up along it, and it led them to this little area beside a stream, which and both of them thought this is a perfect place for us to camp for the night. Close enough to the trail you don't get lost, but not, my friends. Folks, not too close. At the time, the park required that camps being made outside of the designated points along the main trail should be set back out of sight. The old trail, this brindle trail they were on, wasn't on modern maps, so it's likely that the girls found this area entirely by accident. But what appeared to be good fortune at first, perfect place, turned out to be anything but. See, on May 30th, Lolly and Julie's friends began to get concerned. They hadn't heard anything from either girl in about a week at this stage, and though of course this is 1996, it's certainly before the age of constant contact on cell phones, it was still weird for them to be out of contact for that long. Eventually the concern grew to the point that one of their friends contacted Julie's dad to let him know that something was not right, especially because Julie was about to start her new dream job, right? She would have made sure she was back in time for that. Nothing would stop her. He then contacted the police, and with, a little encouragement, a search began. And worryingly, by this point, Taj the dog had already been found by some other hikers and turned over to park rangers, as they knew a golden retriever wouldn't be on the, Appalachian Trail alone. And the search for Lolly and Julie, it didn't last long. The very next day after the girls had been reported missing, on June 1st, the same day Julie had been due to start her new job, park rangers instead made a discovery they'll likely have burned into their memories forever. Their camp was found where they'd parked it on the 24th, about 250 yards off the trail. The camp was in a very eerie state, and there was a smell emanating from the area. Camping items were strewn about the place, and the tent was partially collapsed, but 2 feet could be seen sticking out. Lolly's body was found inside the couple's tent. She'd been bound and gagged with duct tape and her thermal underwear. She was only partially dressed, and her throat had been cut. Around 40 feet away, down an embankment, they found Julie. She was similarly bound and gagged, and her throat had also been cut. Both girls had been zipped up completely in their sleeping bags. It was thought that Lolly had been killed first and fairly quickly when someone had arrived, and then Julie was taken away and sexually assaulted and then murdered herself. There was a little sign of a struggle around the place, but the park rangers did find a couple of things that seemed odd. It seemed like they were placed there. One thing was a vibrator, a sex toy was found there, which they didn't think that the 2 girls had brought. And they also found a pair of gloves, which had appeared to have been left there by whoever had been there, as no foreign fingerprints were found at the scene either. So it seemed like some things had been left there, staged, deliberately placed there at the scene of the crime. They did manage to recover a hair, though, from some duct tape at the scene, and the hair didn't belong to Julie or Lolly, so they were, the authorities were fairly sure that whoever did this, it was their hair. They had the hair of the attacker, but there was some psychopath monster now on the Appalachian Trail, and who knows where they could have gone. In fact, it was even so weird that Lolly and Julie, where they'd been camping was 250 yards off the trail, on a place that wasn't even on the map. So the killer stumbled across them, and then with the items left, they began to think, was this a hate crime? Had they've been targeted because they were lesbians. Lubricant was found at the scene, which they were also pretty sure that the girls hadn't brought with them. So with duct tape, a glove, a knife used to kill them, a sex toy, and lubricant all brought there, they began thinking this killer has a murder kit. They had brought a murder kit with them specifically to... Had he been following them? Had he been tracking them? Was this a serial killer? This didn't seem like a spur-of-the-moment attack if they had brought a goddamn, tools with them.
Early morning in the Shenandoah National Park. Ethan Winter and Jeannie Seipel are still rubbing the sleep out of their eyes when they learn about the murders.
Holy, that doesn't happen in national parks at all, really, does it? I mean, that's extraordinary.
Julianne Williams and Lolly Winans' throats were cut along this trail. The FBI and National Park Service are investigating, but they're not talking.
And why is the trail closed off?
I can't answer that for you. You need to speak to the public information officer.
And who is that?
I'm not sure today. There's been a transition in the command.
Okay.
But you do need to leave the area immediately.
All right.
This is apparently the only part of the Appalachian Trail that's closed off. Even after the brutal murders, hikers continue crossing these paths, most unaware of what happened.
Julianne Williams and Lolly Winans were well aware and ready, but nothing could prepare them for meeting a killer in these woods.
I feel very safe outside, actually. I mean, really, the largest factors are things like weather and not other people, usually.
The FBI took the lead in the investigation, with a lot of boots-on-the-ground work being done by park rangers and local police departments. A $25,000 reward was offered in return for information leading to an arrest in the case. Now, a lot of focus was truly put on the fact that Lolly and Julie were in a same-sex relationship, so the fact that, it must have been a hate crime and stuff. But truly, although that was a theory that was constantly going through people's heads, it seemed unlikely. It seemed more likely it was a spur-of-the-moment attack. The killer had just stumbled across them. It was, although, the fact that he could have been following them, somebody they knew, tracking them, that had to be a possibility that, needed to be explored. It didn't seem plausible, really. After early investigations looked at the usual exes and family members and ruled each of them out in order, the investigation carried on quietly, with little being heard publicly until 6 years later. They quite simply had nothing, and whoever did this could still be stalking the Appalachian Trail. Was the stalking killer still out there? But then, get this, in 2002, the FBI not only announced that they had charged somebody, but they were going to seek the death penalty for the murder of Lolly and Julie. So obviously, if you're thinking, wow, they're going to seek the death penalty, folks, whoa, oh boy. They must have, proof beyond proof. They must have, video evidence of them doing it. Gotta be that hardcore. They said this all before publicly naming who they thought had done it. The Fed zeroed in on 34, 28 years old at the time of the crime, Darrell David Rice. They said he was the man who had stalked the Appalachian Trail. In 2002, by the time the charges were announced, Rice was already in prison. In fact, it's what he was already in prison for that had put investigators in the Shenandoah double murder on his trail. 5 years earlier, 1 year after the Shenandoah double murder, Darrell Rice had tried to grab a cyclist in the Shenandoah National Park. This woman had been trail biking in the national park when she was suddenly accosted by Darrell Rice, and she just about managed to get away by kind of hilariously throwing a soda can at his head. He kept chasing her, and then when they got to the road, he got into his van and tried to run her down. This woman had accurately been able to, get his look, his license plate and all that stuff, and pretty soon Darrell was chased down and arrested for attempted abduction and attempted murder. And when they got to him in his van, what did they find? Tools! Yeah, they found arm restraints, leg restraints, a murder kit, maybe, definitely some kind of kit, and not the kind you ever want to see. Rice was eventually sentenced to 11 years in prison for attempted kidnapping. It was because of his history that investigators looked at him for Lolly and Julie's deaths. Apparently, their suspicion was based on jailhouse informants and otherwise largely circumstantial evidence. So jailhouse snitches were saying, oh yeah, he said he did it, but of course, they were all saying he had said that because, well, maybe they were looking for a little something. Probably just food visitation. But the FBI also announced we found his hair at the scene. That hair on the duct tape. Real quick, one problem. They said it was his hair before they even tested it. And guess what? It wasn't his hair. Despite testing the hair several times, they just had to be sure. They're like, test it again. One more time. Are you sure you tested it right? In 2004, they had to, remove their charges. All the charges were dropped without prejudice, though, which means that they could charge him again later if they found the evidence they were most certainly looking for at this stage. I mean, Darrell Rice obviously wasn't like a great guy, but he was in prison for a reason, like a pretty terrifying reason, but he wasn't the Shenandoah double murderer, and you'd think that you would want to make sure he is before you say, oh, we got him, and we're going to seek the death penalty. Darrell Rice was by no means a nice guy. He was far from it, and he was later connected to another murder, that of Alicia Showalter Reynolds. Alicia Showalter Reynolds was found murdered in the Shenandoah National Park in March of 1996, less than an hour from where Julie and Lolly would be found 2 months later.
And I got to tell you, the police are everywhere tonight. Although authorities can't confirm that the body found today is that of Alicia Showalter Reynolds, they say they cannot ignore the possibility. Police say the body of a young woman was discovered late this afternoon off Route 681 near Lignum. The property is owned by a Fredericksburg paper company that had recently been logged. Authorities say the body appeared to be buried in a shallow grave. Authorities won't confirm if the body is that of 25-year-old Alicia Showalter Reynolds, who's been missing for 2 months after she disappeared near Route 29 near Culpeper. Neighbors in the area expressed shock tonight, saying it's one of the most quiet places in the county.
Investigators had found Alicia's car, and with her car, they'd found a note indicating that something was wrong with the car. It was a note written by Alicia saying, oh, hey, car's broken, gone to go get help. But when the investigators checked her car, it was perfectly fine. There was nothing wrong with her car. So what investigators were thinking is that she'd been driving. Somebody had flagged her down saying, oh, I see a problem with your car. There's sparks coming from it, or something wrong with your exhaust, whatever. They'd flagged her down, gotten her to stop, said, oh, your car's broken. Either you can walk or I'll give you a ride. We'll go get help. And yeah, several other women had reported that somebody had done this to them. They had been driving along. This guy flagged them down saying, there's a problem with your car. They pull over. He comes up beside him and says, hey, I'll drive you to a payphone. Now, some of these women would say he drove them to the payphone and it was absolutely fine. He dropped them off there. They called for a mechanic to come. The mechanic then arrives, though, and says there's nothing wrong with your car. So the woman gets freaked out. Other women would say, though, he flew into a rage, when they tried to confront him about what was going on. And then, of course, maybe there was other women we will never hear from at all, including Alicia Showalter Reynolds. So investigators began to think that maybe all those other incidents of him, this mystery man, flagging down women and then taking to a payphone were him like trialing it out, testing out his little game, his little gimmick, his ploy, building up until Alicia was his unlucky victim.
The reality sinks in. Alicia Reynolds is no longer a missing woman. She is a murder victim.
And the push tonight is to catch her killer. The killer of Alicia Showalter Reynolds is still out there. Police are preparing now for the day he's caught.
They are still searching for evidence in the field near the Culpeper area where Reynolds' body was found in a shallow grave. They want to be sure when they catch their man that the charges stick.
But they're not.
Witnesses had said they had seen Alicia talking to a man on the side of the road. This man matched Darrell Rice's description. Now, though, I gotta say, Darrell Rice was never charged in the Alicia Showalter Reynolds case. Another known serial killer and absolute piece of shit was Richard Mark Evanitz, and he had a long history of violent and sexual crime, including 3 years probation for indecent assault. But he was also most known for being the only suspect in the 1996 abduction and murder of 16-year-old Sophia Silva in Virginia, and then the 1997 double murder of sisters Kristen and Katie Lisk, also in Virginia. These three teens, they'd all been abducted from their very own front lawn. In 2002, Richard Evanitz kidnapped another girl, 15-year-old Cara Robinson Chamberlain. He took her to his home and he had assaulted her. In his house, though, when he fell asleep, Cara managed to escape and she was able to identify him. The police they surrounded his home after being alerted to what he had done. But Richard Mark Evanitz, he decided to be an hero and he refused to give up his gun. The police ended up sending in some canines into his home, and so Evanitz, not seeing any way out, he decided to eat his handgun and diarrhea out the back of his skull. A lot of circumstantial evidence connected Evanitz to the Alicia Showalter Reynolds case, just as it had with Darrell Rice. He was active and not far from where she was found, but she was also older than his usual victims and not really much was found there. So at this point, the police were really trying to connect Julie and Lolly's Shenandoah double murder to the Alicia Showalter Reynolds murder. They happened within an hour of each other, within 2 months of each other. Likely the same killer had done it. If evidence did Showalter or Darrell Rice did Showalter, he likely did the other one. But other than that, they had no real suspects at all regarding Lolly and Julie's case. Like, if you're just looking at that separately, they had nothing to go on. And that was more or less the entire story of the Shenandoah double murder. I even covered this story on the That Chapter podcast about 1.5 years ago, if you can believe that. There's been no real updates by the time I talked about this on the podcast, because since there has been some. And by some, I mean big. It was in the summer of 2024 that the FBI came out with an announcement.
Their murders sparked shock and fear throughout the community and nation. Today, we are proud to stand here and tell you we now know who is responsible for this heinous crime.
They finally believed they knew the identity of the man who brutally murdered Lolly and Julie. His name was Walter Leo Jackson Sr. And I say was because he is dead. Finally, after all of these decades, the police were able to identify him. By the time they did, he had passed away. He had died in prison. And, reading more about Walter Leo Jackson, you would hope it kind of wasn't an easy way to go in that Ohio prison he died in, because when you read into his backstory, he was a monster in the truest sense, and suddenly this entire case sort of makes sense with what was done at their campsite and to them. Walter Leo Jackson was born in 1947 near Cleveland, Ohio. There's not really a whole lot out there on him. His occupation was a house painter, and he went by Leo mostly. The earliest incident I could find he was involved in occurred during the summer of 1996 when Leo was 30 years old. This was in Ohio, and a woman was just walking down the street, walking home, alone. Leo pulls up beside her in his van. He asks her, "Can I give you a ride home?" Say no. Always say no, because once she got in, he did not drive her home. He drove her to a secluded area, and he brutally assaulted her, and he kicked her out of the van. She managed to go to the police. She managed to identify him. The police, they got evidence. They got evidence of the knife he had threatened her with, of restraints, all of these kind of things that were found in his van. They brought it to the prosecutors, who declined to press charges against Walter Leo Jackson Sr. The police even had to give him back the knife he had threatened this poor woman with. And then guess what? Ladies and gentlemen, you won't believe it. 6 months later, he did it again. Who could have seen that coming? And both of those attacks occurred in 1996 after the double murder in the national park, which is kind of baffling as to he murdered Julie and Lolly, but didn't murder... it's a good thing he didn't, but he didn't, which is unusual for a serial predator like Leo Jackson. That's the earliest attacks other than the Shenandoah National Park murders I could find occurring after the double murders. I can't imagine the double murders was that kind of been his first rodeo. He must have been building up to it. But that's the thing, him being dead now, we will never know. After those attacks, he didn't keep quiet. He was later arrested for possession and attacking a police officer in the year 2000. In 2011, he sexually assaulted another woman as she was walking home during the daytime, asking if she wanted a ride. And it was being arrested for this, he was linked to the 2 previous attacks in 1996. In 2021, the FBI began a complete overhaul of the Julie and Lolly Shenandoah double murders, and it was then that they did DNA. DNA is coming on so far. It finally led them to it being conclusively proven to be Walter Leo Jackson Sr. But booty, Leo passed away in an Ohio prison in March of 2018 at 80 years of age. It would be another 6 years before he would be publicly identified as the Shenandoah killer, and he would never face justice for his horrifying crimes, of which there are likely more. Investigators have said they're still looking into link him to any other unsolved cases out there, including the Alicia Showalter Reynolds case. Was he responsible for that? The police always believed that whoever was responsible for one was likely responsible for the other, and he was a known avid hiker. Leo Jackson loved to be out there, loved to be out hiking in the woods. It would make sense he would be responsible for both, but they haven't said if he is or not. We are still left with so many unanswered questions, but in this case, the most important one has finally, after how many decades, been answered. The Mount Marathon race is not the most remote, nor is it the longest, but it probably is one of the most unpleasant races you can do. It's called the Mount Marathon. It's not a marathon, that's just the name of the mountain, so just to note. The Mount Marathon race is the second oldest mountain foot race in the world, since 1915 officially, and it takes place every 4th of July in Seward, Alaska. And boy, is it a doozy. The race begins at 9 a.m. in downtown Seward. Basically, it's up Mount Marathon and back. It's about 3 miles in distance, about 5-ish kilometers. And as I said, it's not the longest, but, well, you know, it's not the distance, it's the mileage, because it seems horrifying. A very steep mountain is what it is.
The richest competitions are born when someone eyes a daunting challenge and wonders how fast it could be done. Then gets egged on by a naysaying bystander who is willing to put their beer money on the line to watch them suffer. It's the 96th running of Mount Marathon, and the journey these mountain warriors will take today marches them 3,000 feet above the high tide line of the North Pacific, where they will round Old Glory waving gallantly at the top, and in just over 3 miles return to the downtown drag strip of this seaside community.
About 350 people take part in each race. There's a youth race, a women's race, and then a men's race. It starts out sprinting down the road, then across a field, and then basically up a staircase, as The Last Man Up by Christopher Solomon describes it. By the way, just in case your curiosity becomes something more, there is no prize for this shite. And extremely dangerous and unpleasant the entire way. Falls, everything happens all the time. So you get up to the top of Mount Marathon and you're only halfway there. Then it's basically a sprint down that's kind of sort of vertical. In videos, people slide down the mountain, and I'm sure that does not feel great at all. And then it's like a dead sprint, which apparently is people describe as...
Oh, that looks pretty fun. He describes it as terrible, but no, it looks pretty cool.
Actually, the worst part is that sprint across asphalt at the very end. And as you can imagine, it is perfectly normal for racers to arrive to the finish line either bleeding profusely or with broken shit. Even Navy SEALs who have done this race had to be airlifted to safety. And the year we're going to talk about, which is in 2012, there was numerous incidents beside the main one of this story. The race year we're talking about, 2012, a 42-year-old Alaskan named Matt Kenny, he fell, suffering a traumatic brain injury. He was almost a vegetable. It took him over a year of just recovery to get back somewhat, to get back to a somewhat normal life. He's still not allowed to drive. A woman named Penny Assman, 34 years old from Utah, she fell. She broke several of her ribs during the race and suffered a lacerated liver. No thanks. Now, no one has ever actually died during the race, but 3 people have died on that mountain, so I think it's a luck more than skill. Nobody has died during the race. Now, usually the 4th of July in Alaska would be very warm, crazy, humid. You'd have mosquitoes the size of dinner plates coming for you. But in 2012, the July 4th of 2012 was not like that at all. It was cold as shit, extremely wet, extremely windy with snowfall. A tough day to go up the mountain, never mind to go up the mountain as part of a race.
What time is it? 550. For heat 2?
But the race did go ahead. Children's in the morning, followed by the women's, and then the men's beginning at 3 p.m. At 5 p.m., a man who frequently did the race arrived to the officials who were at the halfway point, which is on top of Mount Marathon. Now you have to go down, best of luck. And this guy said he was the last person there. He was the last person in the race. The officials, though, they waited up at the summit for about 45 more minutes, just to make sure. And then they started going down the mountain themselves. After going down for about 10 minutes, they did encounter the actual last person. The other guy didn't even know this guy was behind him. The other guy didn't know this guy was behind him, and no one knows where this guy is to this very day. As the officials were going down, they encountered this guy about 200 feet from the top. His bib number was 548. He was going up past the officials, and he asked, how much further to the top? Can I still finish the race? Because, if the officials aren't there, is it still cool for me to keep doing the race? And they said, yeah, go ahead, knock yourself out. It's about 200 more feet, and the hard part's done. You can then start going down. And off he went. You would think if something happened shortly after that, the officials would have heard something. They weren't too far from him, and he was only 200 feet from the top, like relatively close to the top. But they never saw him again. In fact, no one ever saw him again, and those officials remain haunted to this day. That guy's name was Paul Michael Lemater, though he went by his middle name. And this is the final photo ever taken of him, right when he was last seen. Michael was originally from France, ending up in Alaska studying in Fairbanks, and it was there he met Peggy, his future wife. He ended up staying in the United States, living in Anchorage with Peggy, their 3 kids, and he absolutely loved the wilderness of the state. He was a very fit guy. Even for 65 years of age in the year 2012, Peggy would describe him as someone who was always in motion. He went to the gym regularly, did cross-country skiing, did marathons, you name it. He would be out there in the bush, giving it his all. And for work, he had a degree in business administration. He actually worked for the U.S. Air Force. Like, he wasn't a part of the military. He would help soldiers and people transitioning out of the military. He would help them with resumes, CVs. Essentially, the guy I guess you would go to if you're leaving the Air Force. What can I do now? He would be the guy you would go to. But he was truly a good ass dude because he also had an accreditation as a grief counselor. This was just something he did in his spare time was being a grief counselor. He would often volunteer at hospices, places like that, to be with people in their final moments. Like that's a pretty good ass dude, to be fair. Michael, here, this absolute nut for anything tough, outdoorsy Alaskan. Once hearing about this in SeaWorld, he was like, I'm in. He entered the lottery and he won. And it appears that Michael LeMay stayed up Mount Marathon, it appeared. He never was seen again. The average athlete will take an hour and a half, maybe a little bit longer to finish. And Michael was at the very back of the pack. So far back that one man thought he himself was the last. And Michael was still over 45 minutes behind him. He may have overestimated his ability. As I said, this particular race in 2012 was very different from regular ones. It was wet, windy, slippery, and cold. Michael was also unfamiliar with the route, so he could have gotten lost. I mean, he had to ask, how far is the summit from here? The thing is that race organizers recommend you do this route, in your own time, like a dozen times before you attempt the race. Michael didn't. He didn't know the route, and he had never been up this mountain before. The very last photo ever taken of Michael was as he climbed Mount Marathon. The officials who saw him said he did look tired, but as you can see in this picture, he was in good spirits. When he still hadn't come down the mountain by 8 p.m. that night, officials began looking. The search for Michael was extensive, and this far north, this time of year, it doesn't get dark, like ever. So you think that you make it harder for him to get lost and easier for them to find him, but neither happened. There was helicopters, dogs, Mountain Rescue, National Guard. They would search Mount Marathon for 10 days. They would find zero sight of Michael. He simply vanished without a trace, devoured by the mountain. It was very weird and eerie. As you can see in these videos, the race, it's sort of clear. It's not true dense bushes, and the mountain is facing the city. Basically, you can see the city the entire route. It's right there. So how would you get lost? You'd be like, that's where I have to go. And it wasn't terribly deep into the mountains either. It's not the most remote race ever. So what people thought was that, well, the pinnacle of, the halfway point of the race when you start to come down, it's a false summit. So maybe Michael thought he wasn't at the summit. Maybe he kept going, didn't know where he was supposed to turn back, didn't know where the point was because there was no officials. He was on the mountain alone, and he kept going deeper into the mountains. Which, the fact of just being on the mountain alone as it slowly began to get dark, that's scary. Everyone had left, and he was there by himself, unable to find his way home. Michael's daughter would later fly from Utah and spent a month looking over the mountain herself, but she would leave empty-handed. Whatever happened to Michael and where he went, we simply do not know. Did he fall into a ravine or something? Did he keep going deeper into that endless mountain range? Did something else strange or inexplicable happen out there that 4th of July? The weather was bad that day, but searches began almost immediately by 8 p.m. Sunset was at 11:20 p.m. and it never truly gets dark. You would think that there would be some sign of him, but this area, it's never ending. It simply seems like the mountain took him and never gave him back. The mountain still have to this day, who seemed like a really good person, Michael LeMay. Thank you so much for watching. It really means the absolute world.
Yeah, definitely follow this guy, that chapter. He's really good. I'm gonna like the video. But yeah, it's getting late there. I'm falling asleep. So, peace out, guys.